The stars above Earth had never looked so. Wrong Commander Thark of the Vethrani Dominion stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched as 700 warships emerged from a fold space in perfect formation behind him, their hulls gleaming with the cold light of distant suns, their weapons charged and ready for the harvest that awaited them below. He had spent 30 years climbing through the ranks of the Dominion military, crushing rebellions on a dozen worlds, burning cities that dared to resist, and claiming resources for an empire that stretched across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. But this mission was different. This was supposed to be easy. His tactical officers had briefed him extensively on the target world, a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, inhabited by a species called humans, who had barely managed to put a few satellites in orbit around their own moon. They had no kinetic barriers to stop orbital bombardment, no plasma arrays to threaten his ships, no fold-capable vessels to escape or fight back, and no apparent knowledge that intelligent life existed beyond their own atmosphere. The Dominion had been watching Earth for nearly a century, ever since a scout ship had stumbled upon their radio, transmissions leaking into space like blood from a wounded animal. At first, the High Council had considered the humans too primitive to bother with. But times had changed, and the Dominion needed fresh resources and fresh labor for the wars that never seemed to end on the frontier. Earth would provide both. Thark allowed himself a rare smile as he looked at the planet turning slowly below him, its surface covered with lights that marked the locations of major population centers, each one a target, each one full of creatures who had no idea what was coming for them. "Begin landing preparations," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that came from decades of conquest. His officers moved with practiced efficiency, coordinating the deployment of dropships and ground forces that would secure key positions across the planet's surface. Within hours, the plan was simple, because it did not need to be complex. They would destroy any military installations that attempted to resist, capture the major governments, and begin the process of integration that would turn Earth into another productive colony of the Dominion within a generation. Thark had done this before on worlds far more advanced than this one. He turned to his communications officer and prepared to broadcast a standard surrender demand that the Dominion use for primitive species, a message that offered survival in exchange for immediate compliance and promised only death for those who resisted. But before he could speak, something strange happened. The communications array began receiving an encrypted transmission, not from the planet below, but from somewhere behind the fleet. Thark frowned and turned to look at the tactical display that showed the positions of all ships in his armada. But there was something new there, something that had not been present a moment before. A single vessel had appeared approximately 2,000 kilometers behind his flagship. And it was not a Dominion ship. "Identify that vessel," Thark demanded, his voice hardening with suspicion. His officers worked frantically at their stations, running scans and analysis programs that should have told them everything about the unknown ship within seconds. But the results made no sense. The ship was small, barely larger than a patrol craft, with an angular hull covered in scars and modifications that suggested decades of hard use. But that was not what troubled the scanning officers. The ship was running technology that should not exist together. Its hull was coated in Kethari stealth plating, the same material that made the Kethari Phantom ships nearly invisible to conventional sensors. But the Kethari had never sold that technology to anyone. Its weapon systems bore the signature of syndicate-grade plasma cannons, the kind that only the most powerful criminal organizations in the galaxy could afford. And its engines were unmistakably from the forbidden forges of Nexer, legendary facilities that had been destroyed centuries ago in a war that had reshaped the galactic balance. of power. No single ship should have possessed all three. Technologies. No species that the Dominion knew of could have combined them. Commander, the communications officer said, his voice trembling slightly, the vessel is hailing us. Tharek straightened his posture and prepared to deal with whatever pirate or smuggler had been foolish enough to stumble into a Dominion military operation. Put them through, he ordered the main. View screen flickered and displayed the interior of the unknown ship's bridge, and Tharek found himself looking at a creature he recognized from the intelligence reports as a human. She was female by their standards, with short dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold no warmth whatsoever. And she wore a uniform that bore no insignia that Tharek recognized when she spoke. It was in perfect Vethrani, without accent or hesitation, as if she had been speaking his language her entire life. Commander Tharek of the Vethrani Dominion, she said, my name is Captain Elena Vance, and I represent an organization that has a significant interest in the world you are currently planning to invade. Tharek felt his secondary heart skip a beat. Not from fear, but from confusion. How did this human know his name when his species had never made contact with Earth? How did she speak his language when humans were supposed to be ignorant of galactic civilization? How did she possess a ship equipped with technology from 3 different empires that hated each other? You are addressing a commander of the Vethrani Dominion. Tharek replied coldly, and you will explain yourself immediately or be destroyed. Elena Vance smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Tharek deeply uncomfortable. Something that reminded him of predators he had encountered on hostile worlds. Creatures that smiled before they struck. I am here to deliver a warning, she said calmly, and to give you one opportunity to leave this system with your fleet intact. Tharek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across his bridge. 1 ship against 700. The human was either insane or stupid. You threaten me with a single vessel, he said dismissively. While I command the largest invasion force the Dominion has deployed in decades. Elena's smile did not waver. Commander, she said softly, I am not the threat. She leaned forward slightly, and her eyes seemed to grow even colder. I am the courtesy. Elena Vance watched the Vethrani commander's face cycle through confusion and anger, and finally settle on something that looked like arrogant dismissal. She had expected this reaction because she had seen it many times before on many different worlds from many different species who all believed that power came from the size of your fleet or the strength of your weapons. They never understood until it was too late. You have 30 seconds to explain yourself before I order your destruction, Commander Tharek said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had never been challenged by anything. He could not simply crush Elena. Nodded slowly and reached for a control panel on her armrest. I am going to transmit a data packet to your ship, she said calmly, and I strongly suggest you review its contents before making any decisions about my destruction. She pressed a button and sent the file that her organization had spent decades compiling. A file that contained information so sensitive that most species would have started a war to keep it secret. Tharek gestured impatiently to one of his officers, who began analyzing the incoming data with the kind of nervous efficiency that suggested he did not want to disappoint his commander. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as the officer reviewed the contents of the transmission, and Elena watched his face change from boredom to confusion to something that looked very much like fear. Commander, the officer said quietly, you need to see this. Tharek moved to the officer's station and looked at the display, and Elena allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction as she watched his expression transform. The data packet contained coordinates, hundreds of them. Every major Vethrani colony, every military supply depot, Every shipyard, every communication hub, and every strategic installation that the Dominion considered essential to its continued existence was marked on a galactic map. And next to each location was a small notation that simply read, "Asset in place." "What is this?" Thorek demanded, turning back to face Elena with something new in his eyes. Something that might have been the first hint of genuine concern. "That," Elena said, "is a list of every location where my organization has placed operatives over the past 200 years. She let that number sink in before continuing. 200 years. "Commander, while your species was busy conquering worlds and building your precious dominion, my people were doing something far more useful." Tarek shook his head in disbelief. "Impossible," he said. "Humans have never left their own star system. We have been monitoring them for a century, and they have shown no sign of fold space capability." Elena laughed. And the sound was cold enough to make several of the Vethrani officers flinch. "You monitored Earth," she corrected him. "You watched our home planet and our public space programs and our primitive satellites. And you concluded that we were ignorant children playing in our own backyard." She leaned forward in her chair. "Did you never stop to wonder why a species capable of nuclear fission and quantum computing had made so little progress in space travel? Did you never consider that perhaps we were choosing to stay hidden?" Tarek's jaw tightened as he processed her words. "Why would any species choose to remain invisible?" he asked. "Because we saw what happened to species that announced themselves to the galaxy," Elena replied. "We watched you and the Kethari and the Nexer Collective and all the other great powers fight your endless wars over territory and resources. We watched you conquer and enslave and destroy anything that threatened your dominance." She paused to let her words sink in. "And we decided that we wanted no part of your game." Tharek made a sound of contempt. "So you hid like cowards while the real power shaped the galaxy." Elena's smile returned, and this time it was almost pitying. "No, Commander, we did not hide. We simply chose a different strategy." She gestured at the data still displayed on the Vethrani officer's screen. "While you were busy with your military conquests, we were building something far more valuable. An invisible empire that spans every sector of known space." She began to list their achievements with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "The Carthan drug trade that funds half the criminal enterprises in the Outer Rim. My people control 60% of it. The illegal weapons that flow to rebel factions fighting against your dominion, they come from human suppliers. The mysterious gray brokers who have been destabilizing your rivals for decades, they are human." Tharek's face had gone pale beneath his scaled skin. "The black markets where your own officers buy contraband. Human operated. The smuggling lanes that move goods past your border patrols. Human designed. The information networks that sell secrets to the highest bidder. Human controlled." Elena spread her hands in a gesture that encompassed the entire galaxy. "We never conquered a single world. Commander, we never claimed a single system. We never announced ourselves to the galactic community because we did not need to." She leaned back in her chair with the confidence of someone holding every winning card. "We simply made ourselves essential to everyone who operates outside the law. And in a galaxy as corrupt as this one, that means we are essential to everyone." Tharek was silent for a long moment, processing the implications of what she was telling him. "Even if what you say is true," he finally said, "what does this have to do with your current threat? You cannot expect me to believe that criminals and smugglers can stop a Dominion invasion fleet." Elena shook her head slowly. "You still do not understand. Commander, we are not going to stop your fleet with weapons." She pointed at the data on his screen. "Every one of those assets I mentioned is currently in position, waiting for a single command from me, and if I give that command, they will not attack your military installations." Her voice dropped to something almost gentle. They will simply stop doing their jobs. Tharek frowned in confusion. What does that mean? It means that the supply ships carrying food to your frontier colonies will suddenly develop navigation problems. It means that the fuel depots your fleet depends on will experience unfortunate accidents. It means that the communication networks that keep your empire connected will suffer mysterious failures. Elena's eyes were cold and steady. It means that every system that keeps the Dominion functioning smoothly will begin to break down. Not through attack, but through absence. Because we have spent 2 centuries making ourselves the invisible machinery that keeps galactic civilization running. She watched understanding dawn on Tarek's face. You cannot fight us because you do not know where we are. You cannot negotiate with us because we do not want anything you can offer. And you cannot ignore us because we are already inside everything you depend on. Elena stood up from her chair and moved closer to the screen. So here's my warning. Commander, you can turn your fleet around and leave this system and pretend that this conversation never happened. And everything will continue as it has for the past 2 centuries. Her voice hardened. Or you can proceed with your invasion. And you will discover exactly what happens when humanity decides to stop being helpful. She gave him one final look, filled with something that might have been genuine regret. Earth is our home. Commander, it is the one thing we have protected through all of this. The one place that we have kept off the board. Her hand moved toward a control panel. And I promise you, if you touch it, we will burn everything you have ever built to the ground. The transmission ended, and Tharek stood alone on his bridge, surrounded by officers who were looking at him with expressions of barely concealed fear. For the first time in his career, he did not know what to do. The hours that followed Elena Vance's transmission were the most chaotic in Dominion intelligence. History Commander Tharek had immediately contacted the High Council on the Dominion homeworld and relayed everything the human captain had told him, expecting them to dismiss her claims as the desperate bluff of a primitive species. Instead, he watched the faces of the most powerful beings in the Dominion turn pale with shock as they began to investigate her assertions. The first confirmation came within minutes. A senior intelligence officer reported that the Grey Brokers, the mysterious information dealers who have been manipulating galactic politics for over a century, had indeed been traced back to human operatives on 3 separate occasions. Each time, the investigation had been quietly buried by officials who were later discovered to be receiving payments from unknown sources. The second confirmation was far more disturbing. The Carthan drug trade, which generated more wealth than many legitimate economies, had always been assumed to be controlled by the Carthan themselves. But a deep audit of shipping records revealed that 63% of all distribution networks were managed by shell companies that trace back to a single origin point, a small human colony hidden in the asteroid field of an uninhabited system that the Dominion had never bothered to survey. The reports kept coming, each one more alarming than the last. Human fingerprints were everywhere in the galactic underworld, not as minor players or occasional participants, but as architects and managers of criminal enterprises that spanned dozens of species and hundreds of worlds. They had been operating in plain sight for 2 centuries, hiding behind 1,000 different aliases and front organizations, and no one had ever connected the pieces because no one had ever thought to look. How could they have looked when humanity was supposed to be a primitive species trapped on a single planet? Tharek stood in his command center and listened to the cascade of revelations with growing horror. The weapons that had armed the rebellion on Nexer 7 had been supplied by humans. The assassination of the Kithari trade minister had been arranged by humans. The economic collapse that had weakened the Syndicate coalition had been engineered by humans. Every major event that had shaped galactic politics in the past century had human involvement buried somewhere. In its foundations, invisible threads that connected everything to a species that officially did not exist on the galactic stage. How is this possible? Tharek demanded of his intelligence chief, a veteran officer who had spent 40 years tracking threats to the Dominion, the intelligence. Chief looked older than Tharek had ever seen him. They found fold space technology before we found them, he said quietly. Our analysis suggests they recovered it from a crash probe sometime in their 19th century, long before they developed the industrial capacity to build their own ships. He pulled up a timeline on the display screen. By the time we started monitoring Earth, they had already been operating in the galaxy for over 100 years. They saw us watching their planet and they deliberately kept it primitive while they built their real civilization elsewhere. Tharek shook his head in disbelief. But why? Why would any species choose to live in the shadows when they could have built an empire of their own? The intelligence chief was silent for a long moment. Because they learned from our mistakes, he finally said. They watched the great powers rise and fall. They saw how empires attract enemies and how conquest breeds resistance. And they decided that there was a better way to achieve power. He gestured at the mountain of evidence on the screens around them. They did not want territory, because territory must be defended. They did not want recognition, because recognition attracts attention. They wanted influence. The kind of quiet control that nobody notices until it is far too late. Tharek turned back to the viewport and looked at Earth hanging peacefully in the void, its surface still twinkling with the lights of cities that seemed so vulnerable from orbit. They are parasites, he said with contempt. They have built nothing of their own, only stolen from others. The intelligence chief made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh, with respect. Commander, parasites do not coordinate operations across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. Parasites do not maintain cover identities for multiple generations. Parasites do not build the most sophisticated intelligence. Network in known space without anyone noticing. He met Tharek's eyes with an expression of grudging respect, whatever else they are. The humans are not parasites. They are predators who have chosen to hunt in a way that their prey cannot understand. Tharek was about to respond when a priority alert flashed across every screen in the command center. It was a message from the Dominion homeworld, transmitted on the highest security channel available, and it carried the personal seal of the High Arbiter, the supreme leader of the Vethrani people. Tharek opened the message with trembling hands. The contents were brief and devastating. All Dominion military operations were to be suspended immediately pending a full security review. Every intelligence asset in the field was being recalled for verification, and the invasion of Earth was to be postponed until further notice. The High Council had been convinced by Elena Vance's evidence. They were afraid Tharek felt something break inside him, some fundamental belief in the invincibility of the Dominion that has sustained him through decades of service. He had commanded fleets that could destroy worlds. He had crushed enemies that had seemed unconquerable. And he had never once doubted that the Dominion would triumph over any challenge, but this was different. This was not an enemy that could be fought with ships and soldiers. This was not a threat that could be eliminated with superior firepower. This was something that had already won a war that the Dominion had not even known it was fighting. He looked at his officers, at the fear and confusion on their faces, and he made a decision. He had not climbed to his position by following orders that he disagreed with. He had achieved everything he had by taking bold action when others hesitated. And he was not going to let his legacy be defined by retreat in the face of criminal threats. Ignore the recall order, he commanded, his voice steady with renewed determination. We proceed with the invasion as planned. His officers exchanged nervous glances. Commander, his second-in-command said carefully, the High Council has specifically ordered us to withdraw. Tharek turned to face him with the cold authority that had made him one of the most feared commanders in the Dominion fleet. The High Council is operating on incomplete information and emotional reactions. They have been frightened by stories of human influence that may be greatly exaggerated. He gestured at the planet below. What I see is a primitive world with no visible defenses, defended by a single ship with an arrogant captain who thinks that threats can substitute for actual military power. His voice hardened. We will call her bluff. We will complete our mission. And we will prove that the Dominion does not bow to criminals and smugglers, regardless of how many shadows they hide in. He turned back to the viewport. Begin the landing sequence somewhere behind the fleet. Elena Vance watched the Dominion ships begin their descent toward Earth, and she allowed herself a small sigh of disappointment. She had hoped he would be smart enough to listen. She reached for her communications panel and opened a channel to every human operative in the galaxy. This is Vance, she said calmly. Initiate Protocol Sunrise. All assets are authorized for immediate action. She paused for a moment, looking at the planet she had spent her entire life protecting. They chose this, she said softly to herself. Remember that when it starts, they chose this. The channel closed, and across 1,000 worlds, humanity went to work. The first wave of Dominion landing craft descended toward Earth's major cities with the confidence of predators approaching helpless prey. 30,000 soldiers in 200 vessels, each one carrying enough firepower to level a small town. Each one crewed by veterans who had participated in dozens of successful planetary invasions. They expected resistance from primitive ground forces. Using chemical propellant weapons, they expected confusion and panic from a population that had never encountered alien life. They expected an easy victory that would secure a commander. Tharek's reputation as one of the greatest military leaders in Dominion history. What they did not expect was the moon. The first indication that something was wrong came when the Lid landing craft reported a massive energy signature emanating from the lunar surface. A signature that matched no known weapon system in the Dominion database before anyone could respond. A beam of coherent light lanced out from a crater on the moon's dark side and vaporized 12 landing craft in a single devastating strike. The survivors scattered in confusion, their pilots desperately trying to evade whatever weapon had just killed a quarter of their comrades. But more beams followed from different locations across the lunar surface, hidden bases that humanity had built over 2 centuries of secret expansion revealed themselves in a storm of fire and light. The moon, which Dominion intelligence had dismissed as a barren rock with a few primitive human monuments on its surface, had been transformed into a fortress Tharek watched in horror. From his flagship, as his landing force was systematically destroyed, where did these weapons come from? He demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. His tactical officer was frantically analyzing the energy signatures of the lunar defense grid. Commander, these weapons are a hybrid design. They combine Cathari focusing crystals with Syndicate power cores and targeting systems that appear to be entirely human in origin. The officer looked up with fear in his eyes. They have been building this for decades, possibly centuries, right under our surveillance. But the lunar defenses were only the beginning. As the surviving landing craft attempted to retreat back to the fleet, new contacts began appearing on tactical displays across the Dominion Armada. Ships were emerging from hiding places throughout the solar system, from asteroid bases and deep space stations and locations that no Dominion scan had ever detected. They were not elegant vessels like the warships of civilized powers. They were ugly, brutal machines built for one purpose, covered in weapons and armor and bearing the scars of 100 battles fought in the lawless sectors of the galaxy. The human fleet had been waiting. Elena Vance's voice crackled across every Dominion communication channel as her ship led the emerging armada toward Tharek's position. I told you, Commander, I was the courtesy. The battle that followed would be studied by military academies across the Toons Galaxy for generations. The Dominion fleet outnumbered the human forces by nearly 3-1. They had superior shields and more powerful primary weapons. And they had centuries of experience fighting conventional naval engagements. None of it mattered. The human ships fought with a ferocity and coordination that defied everything the Dominion understood about warfare. They used tactics that no legitimate military would ever consider. They sacrificed vessels to create openings for their comrades. They targeted systems that were supposed to be invulnerable to attack. They fought like criminals, like pirates, like the desperate, dangerous people who survived in the lawless spaces. Between empires, they fought like people who had nothing to lose. The battle lasted 11 minutes when it ended. Less than 100 Dominion vessels remained operational, and Commander Thorek's flagship was drifting dead in space, its engines destroyed, its weapons silenced, its proud commander standing on a bridge filled with the bodies of his crew. Elena Vance's ship pulled alongside the crippled flagship, and a boarding party forced their way onto the bridge. Thorek expected to be executed on the spot, but instead, the human soldiers simply secured the area and waited. Elena herself arrived a few minutes later, walking through the carnage with the daze. Calm detachment of someone who had seen far worse in her career. "You should have listened," she said simply. Standing before the defeated Commander, Thorek spat at her feet. "You are criminals and murderers. You have no honor. You have no legitimacy. You are nothing but vermin that the galaxy will eventually exterminate." Elena studied him for a long moment, then shook her head with something that might have been pity. "You still do not understand. Commander, this was never about honor or legitimacy. This was about survival." She walked to the viewport and looked at Earth, still untouched, still protected. When we discovered that we were not alone in the universe, we had a choice. We could join your civilization and play by your rules and hope that we would be strong enough to survive the inevitable wars and conquests that define galactic politics. She turned back to face him. Or we could build something different. Something that did not depend on territory or recognition. Something that could not be destroyed by fleets or armies, because it existed in the spaces that fleets and armies cannot reach. Her voice was calm and steady. "We chose survival, Commander, and we have spent 200 years preparing for the day when someone would finally try to take our home." She gestured at the destroyed fleet visible through the viewport. "This is what that preparation looks like." The wreck was silent, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his defeat. "What happens now?" He finally asked. Elena's expression hardened. "Now we send a message." She activated her communication device and spoke in a voice that was suddenly amplified across every inhabited world in the Dominion sphere of influence. "My name is Elena Vance, and I speak for the Terran Syndicate, an organization that has been operating in this galaxy for over 2 centuries without your knowledge or consent." She paused to let those words sink in across 1,000 worlds. "Today, the Vethrani Dominion attempted to invade our homeworld. They ignored our warnings, they dismissed our capabilities, and they have paid the price for their arrogance." Her voice grew cold. "But the destruction of their invasion fleet is not the message we wish to send. The message is what comes next." She looked at Thorek as she continued speaking. "Commander Thorek violated our one rule. He touched Earth, and so we are going to make an example of him and everyone who supported this invasion." She took a breath. "Effective immediately. Every human operative embedded in Dominion territory is authorized to cease all cooperation with Dominion interests. Trade routes will close, supply lines will fail, information networks will go dark, and every system that depends on our invisible support will begin to collapse." Her final words were delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. The Vethrani Dominion invaded our home. And now we are going to show the galaxy what happens when humanity stops being helpful. The transmission ended, and across the Dominion, the lights began to go out. Not literally, not at first, but in ways that were far more devastating. Ships that had been carrying essential supplies simply disappeared, their human crews abandoning them in remote systems. Communication satellites experienced mysterious failures. Fuel depots reported contamination that made their reserves unusable within a day. The Dominion economy was in chaos within a week. It was in collapse, and through it all, Elena Vance watched from her ship with the cold satisfaction of a predator that had finally been given permission to hunt. 6 months after the failed invasion, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Vethrani Dominion, which had been one of the 3 great powers that controlled known space, existed in name only, its territories fragmented into dozens of smaller states, its military reduced to a shadow of its former strength, its economy dependent on humanitarian aid from species it had once conquered. Commander Thark had been returned to his homeworld in disgrace, stripped of his rank and titles, and forced to watch as everything he had spent his life building crumbled around him. The High Council had blamed him for the catastrophe, but everyone knew that the true cause was far larger than one commander's arrogance. They had simply never understood what they were dealing with. Elena Vance stood on the observation deck of Waystation Null, the hidden capital of the Terran Syndicate, and looked out at the stars that humanity had claimed without anyone noticing. The station floated in a region of space that appeared on no official map, protected by stealth technology and surrounded by a fleet that could challenge any power in the galaxy around her. The station hummed with activity, human operatives coordinating operations across 1,000 worlds. Managing the invisible empire that had taken 2 centuries to build, a young officer approached her with a data tablet in his hands. Captain Vance, the Conclave of Species has formally requested a meeting. They want to discuss terms for humanity's entry into legitimate galactic civilization. Elena laughed softly at the word legitimate. For 200 years, humanity had operated outside the boundaries of what the great powers considered acceptable. They had built their influence through means that civilized species would never admit to using. They had achieved power through patience and cunning rather than conquest and force. And now the civilized species wanted to negotiate. Tell them we will consider their request, Elena said. In a few centuries, perhaps. The young officer frowned in confusion. Captain, with respect, this is an opportunity we have been waiting for since the beginning. We could finally take our place among the recognized powers. We could stop hiding and start building openly. Elena turned to face him, and her expression was patient but firm. What do you think would happen if we accepted their offer? If we became just another empire with territory to defend and borders to patrol? The officer was silent. So Elena continued, we would become a target. We would have to maintain fleets and armies to protect our holdings. We would have to engage in the same endless wars that have consumed every other power in this galaxy. Shook her head. That is not what we built. And it is not what we want. She turned back to the viewport. Our strength has never been in ships or weapons. It has been in our invisibility, in our ability to be everywhere and nowhere. In the fact that no one can fight us because no one can find us. Her voice grew thoughtful. The moment we become visible, the moment we claim territory and accept recognition, we lose everything that makes us powerful. She watched a cargo ship depart from the station, carrying goods to markets that had no idea where they came from. The other powers think that we were hiding because we were weak, that we were afraid to face them directly. And now that we have proven our strength, they expect us to behave like a normal civilization. A small smile crossed her face. They still do not understand. She turned back to the young officer. We were never hiding because we were weak. We were hiding because it was more efficient. Because invisible power is far more valuable than visible power. Because you cannot fight what you cannot see. She walked toward the exit of the observation deck. Send a message to the Conclave. Tell them that the Terran Syndicate is grateful for their invitation, but we have no interest in joining their community at this time." She paused at the doorway and told them that we hope they have learned something from what happened to the Dominion. "We do not seek conflict, we do not want territory, and we have no desire to threaten anyone who leaves us alone." Her eyes hardened, but Earth is not negotiable. And anyone who forgets that lesson will receive the same reminder that Commander Thorek received. The officer nodded and hurried away to deliver the message. Elena walked through the corridors of Way Station Null, passing human operatives who had been born and raised in the hidden stations and ships that made up humanity's true civilization. They had never seen Earth in person. Most of them, they knew it only from images and stories passed down through generations. But they all understood what it represented. It was home. It was the one thing that humanity had protected through all of this. The one place that they had kept, safe from the chaos and violence of the galaxy. And it would remain protected. For as long as the Syndicate existed, Elena entered her private quarters and sat down in front of a window that looked out at the stars. She thought about the future, about the centuries that stretched ahead, about the challenges that humanity would face as they continued to grow their invisible empire. Other species would eventually figure out what they were doing. They would learn from the Dominion's mistakes and develop ways to detect human operatives. They would build systems that did not depend on the infrastructure that the Syndicate controlled. But that was fine. Humanity had always been adaptable. They had always found new ways to survive and thrive in conditions that should have destroyed them. And they would continue to evolve as the galaxy changed around them. That was the real secret of their success. Not the technology they had stolen or the networks they had built, but the simple human capacity to see a problem and find a way around it. Elena looked at the stars and allowed herself a rare moment of hope. Somewhere out there, on a small blue planet that most of the galaxy had dismissed as irrelevant, billions of humans lived their lives without knowing that they were the most protected species in the way universe. They went to work and raised their families and complained about their governments and dreamed about the stars, never suspecting that their children and grandchildren were already out there, building something that would outlast every empire that had ever existed. They were safe. They were home. And as long as Elena Vance and the Terran Syndicate drew breath, they would remain that way. She stood up and walked back to the viewport, looking at the galaxy that humanity had quietly claimed without firing a single shot in conquest. The great powers could keep their empires. They could keep their territories and their fleets and their endless wars. They could keep their legitimate civilization with all its rules and boundaries. Humanity had found something better. They had found leverage. And in a galaxy as corrupt and complicated as this one, leverage was worth more than all the warships ever built. Elena smiled and turned away from the window. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to appreciate what her species had accomplished. They had come from a single planet. They had been surrounded by powers that could have destroyed them 1,000 times over. And they had survived not through strength, but through patience. Not through conquest, but through cunning. They had looked at the galaxy and decided that the game everyone else was playing was not worth winning, so they had built their own game, and they had won it without anyone even knowing they were playing. The stars continued to shine outside the window, cold and distant and beautiful, filled with dangers and opportunities that humanity was still learning to navigate. But that was all right. They had time, they had always had time, and in the end, that patience, that willingness to think in centuries rather than years, to build slowly and carefully rather than rush toward quick victories, had been their greatest weapon. The galaxy belonged to the empires that had claimed it, but the future belonged to the species that was patient enough to wait for it. Elena Vance turned off the lights in her quarters and went to sleep, dreaming of stars and shadows and the beautiful, terrible, wonderful universe that humanity had made its own.